사로 영국에서 일하시는 임상심리학자인 루시 존스톤 박사님을 모시고 우리가 흔히 이야기하는 정신질환이라고 하는 것을 어떻게 이해할 수 있는가, 어떻게 다시 이제 새로운 방식으로 이제 정신질환이라고 하는 것을 이해할 수 있는가에 관한 강연을 듣도록 하겠습니다.
Hello, thank you for inviting me to talk today. I'm very pleased to be here, although I'm actually back in the UK. And I'm going to talk about something called the Power Threat Meaning Framework, which is a very new way of understanding the experiences that we call mental illness. And this is only a brief introduction. It's quite a long, complicated document, but I'm going to give you lots of links and further reading in case you want to find out more about it. And at the end, I'm going to give you an example of what it might look like in practice. So in the UK, which is where I live, we have quite a lot of criticisms of the diagnostic model, the idea that people in distress have to be given a diagnosis and that they have a medical illness of some sort. So some of the things people quite often say in the UK are things like, we are dealing with people with problems, not patients with illnesses. And instead of asking what's wrong with you, we need to ask what's happened to you. And one of the things that we also say is, instead of giving someone a diagnosis, we need to listen to your story. We need to really understand what's happened in your life, because if we really understood that, we would very often find that your distress, your difficulties are an understandable reaction to unusual or distressing or difficult circumstances. And in fact, anyone else who'd had the same experiences might have ended up reacting in the same way. So the Power Threat Meaning Framework is a way of building on those ideas. They're not new ideas, but the Power Threat Meaning Framework pulls these ideas together and helps to give them a more solid basis in evidence, and helps to support all sorts of ways of understanding distress which are not just based on diagnosis and which don't see these experiences as an illness. So what the framework says is that instead of understanding distress as though it's the same kind of thing as a medical illness, something that goes wrong in our bodies like cancer or pneumonia or whatever, we have to understand distress as something that people do because of their social and relationship circumstances. It's not the same as a medical illness. We need a different way of looking at it. And the framework is optional. No one has to read it. No one has to like it. Nobody has to do anything with it. But it is a way that people can put together a personal story or narrative instead of a diagnosis if they want. And some peer groups in the UK have started to do this. You don't need to have a professional to help you do that, although perhaps you do have a professional who can help you do that. And it's attracted a lot of interest in the UK and all around the world. Okay, so the names at the top are the people who were the main authors of the Power Threat Meaning Framework, and we're all psychologists, and two of the people, Jackie Dillon and Ella Longdon, are people who've been through the mental health system and been given lots of labels and diagnoses and decided to leave the mental health system behind because they didn't agree with that way of understanding their problems. And we also ask advice from a number of other people, and the groups are listed there. So in total, there are about 40 people who contributed to the project, and it took 5 years to write. And about 1/3 of those people had been through the psychiatric system themselves. They had been or are mental health patients themselves. So it's not just a professional document, it's written alongside service users. And the whole project was funded by the Division of Clinical Psychology. That's my professional body, and it's part of the British Psychological Society. But it's not an official position that all psychologists in the UK take. Some agree with it, some don't. this is a link to a website which you're welcome to visit. It's got lots of examples and resources and videos and people's stories, and we're adding to it all the time. And it's also got the Power Threat Meaning Framework documents, which are quite long and complex, but they're there if you want to look at them. Okay, so the framework is something that we hope shows us how we can recognize that emotional distress and sometimes very unusual or upsetting experiences are understandable given what's happened to somebody. It puts back the link between distress and social injustice. So we are saying very strongly that personal distress, individual distress, has to be understood in a bigger social context. And very often that's to do with living in societies that are in various ways unequal and unjust. And it's about giving people more power and resources. It's about helping people to create their own stories. And it's about promoting social action. It's not just about particular people feeling better. It's about all of us working together to create a fairer society. And it can be used in services, but equally well, it can be used outside services, perhaps without any professional support. Okay. So, because it's quite a long and complicated document, we have got some core questions, some basic questions, which kind of summarize what the document is about. So I'm going to describe each of the core questions in turn. So the first core question is, what has happened to you? So the framework helps us to think about what has happened to you in your life. And another way of saying the same thing is, how does power operating in your life? I'm going to explain this in a minute. The second question is, how did it affect you? Another way of saying that is, what kind of threats does this pose? The third question is, what sense did you make of it? In other words, what meaning did those experiences have to you? And the fourth question is, what did you have to do to survive? And another way of saying that is, what kinds of threat response are you using? Okay, and you would probably want to add a question like, what are your strengths? In other words, what are the good things in your life? Who are the people who support you and who help you? And once you've got some kind of response to all those questions, you can put it all together by saying, what is your story? If we add the answers to all these questions together, you will end up with a personal story, or it might be a family story, or a story of a social group, or perhaps even of a whole community, perhaps. And you don't have to ask these questions exactly in those words or in that order. These are areas to think about, and the questions overlap. If you think about one question, you'll probably find you've already got some answers to the other questions. When I show you the example, you'll see what I mean, but these are things we need to think about in order to put together our story that explains our own particular form of distress. So I'm now going to go through the questions in a bit more detail. So the first question that we looked at is about power. So what happened to you? How is power operating in your life? So you don't need to read all these words, but basically we have thought about power in a number of different ways. So some of these ways we're quite used to thinking about. So interpersonal power, at least in the UK, we are quite used to thinking about the various ways people can neglect or hurt or abuse or bully or be violent to each other. And very often those experiences are in the background of people who have later come into the mental health system. So we do think a bit about that, at least in the UK we do. But a lot of these other forms of power we don't think about so much. So it's about whether we've got enough money to survive on, whether we have the confidence to find our way in the world, whether we have the right kind of education that's going to help us, or whether people are forcing us to do things against our will, whether the law is undermining us and not being helpful to us. So we think you need to think about all those forms of power in your life. And we particularly place a focus on what we've called ideological power, which I'm going to talk a little bit more just now. So ideological power, what this means is the power that people often have to decide what we believe, what we think, what we assume to be true, what we mean by events, how we're going to experience events. So this is it's not as obvious a form of power as being hit or being legally locked up or imprisoned. This is more subtle. It's more hard to work out sometimes when people are exerting ideological power over you. Perhaps they're ignoring your thoughts and beliefs. Perhaps they're telling you that you come from a group that has no value. Perhaps they're saying your wishes don't count. And one of the ways ideological power works, we think, is that when people end up in the mental health system or the prison system, it's because social problems in our society are turned into individual problems, and we say this is basically a mad person or a bad person and the problem lies within them. Now, it may be partly within them, but actually it will always have roots that go beyond the person. There will always be quite a large element of social power in any of those experiences. So we are opposed to individualizing problems, and psychiatry does that, but also psychology often does that. Problems don't just happen in our brains, our bodies, in our minds, in our heads. Problems happen in society, and we can't blame it all on the individual. Next slide. So one of the things that can happen in mental health services is that powerful people like doctors and nurses tell people in distress that they have illnesses called things like bipolar disorder or schizophrenia or personality disorder or clinical depression. And they are told that these things are facts and you are not allowed to disagree with them. But actually, these are not facts. And even a very powerful psychiatrist who's the chair of the committee that drew up one of the editions of the diagnostic manuals has said there is no reason to believe that these manuals are safe or scientifically sound. Now, a lot of people don't know this, but actually these are not valid scientific categories. They are not based on evidence. They are simply things that people decide to turn into diagnoses by sitting round a table and discussing them. And yet people are told you have an illness like bipolar disorder as if it's a fact, like, you might have cancer or something like that. And it isn't. And most people are not given choices. They're not told there are different views, and actually they may be punished for disagreeing. So that is an example of ideological power. And one of the things we want the framework to do is to give people the confidence to say, well, actually that explanation doesn't make sense to me, and I don't personally want to see my problems in that way. Okay. So how does it affect you? This kind of follows on from the first question in a way. If power is operating negatively in your life, of course, power can also be positive, but if it's operating negatively, it may affect your relationships, your emotions, your links to the community, your economic situation. Next slide. It may affect your environment, it may affect your body, and it may also, as we've just said, affect your ability to decide what you believe in, how you want to lead your life, how you want to understand your difficulties. Okay, the next question is, what sense did you make of it? That's right. So meaning is a very core aspect of the framework. The sense we make of our experiences shapes how we feel about them. So many people who experience distress have built up meanings about things like, I should be ashamed of myself, I'm a bad person, I'm a person who's flawed, I feel very afraid, I feel very guilty, and so on. So we need to think about where those meanings come from. And you can think about those meanings in therapy, and that can be helpful, but we want to look at those meanings not just inside the individual and their mind. We want to say, where do those meanings come from? So, next slide. So we want to think about things like common meanings that are shared in particular societies. So all societies have views about what it is to be a good person or a happy family or a good citizen or whatever. And, you know, those may be helpful things, but they may be unhelpful things. We are told to live up to certain standards. And so our own meanings come partly from these wider meanings. So, for example, I've worked with a lot of women who have been raped or sexually abused, and very commonly those women will say, I feel so ashamed, it was my fault, I shouldn't have been there, I must be to blame, I must be a bad person in some way. Now, if you've met many, many, many women all saying the same thing, then it's sensible to say, well, where does that meaning come from? It can't be just inside one person, because everybody seems to be saying similar things. So if you look at what society says all sorts of things about how women ought to behave and what they ought to wear and where they ought to go at night and all that kind of stuff. And may encourage people to disbelieve women who say they've been raped, or may not want to hear about people who've been abused as adults or children. So that's partly where the meanings come from. So we need to look at the meanings beyond the individual. And if we trace those meanings back, we may find that there are ideological meanings at the root of it. So, for example, it may suit a certain society, I think this is true in the UK, to deny the very widespread occurrence of, let's say, rape or sexual abuse. If we can blame the individual so they feel it's my personal fault and I'm too ashamed to talk about it, then as a whole society, we don't have to think about it. So that would be an ideological pressure, if you like. So one of the ways of helping people to get over distress is to help them to see it's not just about me, it's about wider messages, it's about the whole society we live in. And that can encourage, in this example, women to put the blame back where it belongs. It wasn't my fault. Somebody else treated me in a way they shouldn't. Other people didn't listen to me or support me or protect me. It's not my fault. I don't have to carry the shame and the blame. So there are all sorts of ways in which, you know, all societies have to organise themselves in certain ways. And those may be helpful ways, but they are often unhelpful ways. Okay, next question. What did you have to do to survive? So if we find ourselves in positions which are very difficult for us because of the operation of power, we have to find a way of surviving. So from the framework point of view, the ways we survive are not psychiatric symptoms, they're actually things that we had to do that may have helped us at the time. We may have had to be very alert and afraid of danger and very scared of people, or we may hear voices, which is a very interesting experience because this may suggest that something so upsetting happened to us that we had to cut it off into a different part of our mind, and later it comes back as hearing voices. So there are all sorts of ways we had to survive. And these are not symptoms, they're threat responses. They were useful at the time, but of course they can become a problem. And they are partly based on what happens in our bodies. So the framework includes the role of the body. So there's quite a lot of work in the UK and in America looking at about how our bodies are affected by threat. And they can be affected by us going into a state of alertness and terror, for example, or panic or anxiety. And of course, that can be useful when you're facing danger. But if somehow you never learn that the danger is past, then it's not helpful to stay in that very alert state in your body, for example. So the idea is you may need to revisit some of the difficult experiences, and you may need to express your feelings about them, and you may need to learn that you don't need to use these threat responses, and you may need to make some changes in your life. Okay, next question. But threat responses are not exactly the same as symptoms, because some of the things we use as threat responses we won't get into trouble for because they are valued by a particular society. So in the UK, for example, there is, I think, a lot of pressure to work much too hard. It may be the same in Korea. And actually, up to a certain point, that isn't very helpful. we can use that as a threat response. Everything in my life is too difficult, I'll work too hard. But people can break down through working too hard. You know, the messages of society can push you too hard, and then you may end up with problems. So it kind of follows from that threat responses will vary in different cultures, because different cultures have different standards. They have different pressures, they have different cultural meanings. So the way someone expresses distress in the UK is not going to be exactly the same as the way they may express it in South Korea or in South America or in India or wherever, because cultures are very different. And that's a problem for the medical model, because of course illnesses should look the same wherever you are in the world. Cancer looks the same wherever you are in the world. But from a framework point of view, because we're thinking about patterns in meaning, it makes sense that our threat responses may be a bit different. Okay. So one of the main purposes of the framework is to restore the link between threats and threat responses. In other words, we need to think about the way people are reacting, but we also need to think about, well, why has that happened? So as soon as we say everybody in this particular community seems to be very depressed, and maybe we need some more pills, or maybe they've all got, there's an epidemic of mental illness, then we stop looking at the reasons why they may be depressed. And actually we do know that in deprived communities, more people are depressed and miserable. It's not surprising. But as soon as we say, oh, well, it's because they've got an illness called depression, we stop looking at those understandable links. So the framework wants to put back the link between how you feel, depressed and anxious and miserable, and the environment you're living in, which gives you good reasons for being depressed and anxious and miserable. Next question. Okay, this is a more complicated bit of the framework, which I'm only going to touch on very briefly, but one of the things the framework does is to put together patterns which are bigger than individuals of typical ways that people respond to certain power influences. So there are patterns which are based on the meanings that people create, which are quite typical of certain power abuses, perhaps feeling socially excluded and isolated, or perhaps having been personally neglected and hurt. So if you want to look at those patterns, then it helps you to kind of see how your individual personal story is only an example of a much bigger one. Like a woman who's been raped, my particular story of shame is only part of a much bigger story of shame. And there can be similar patterns for men, of course. It may be in slightly different circumstances. Okay, so the patterns are not patterns of conditions that people have, like we're told you have an illness. They are patterns of what people do. They're patterns of how people survive, and they help us to put together our personal stories. Okay. And we've mentioned culture a little bit. So there is, across the world at the moment, our mainly Western diagnostic system is being exported across the world to all sorts of countries and cultures that didn't and often still don't have that as a way of thinking about distress. And we think that's a very bad thing, because actually the diagnostic model doesn't work very well even in Western countries, and it works much less well in cultures with very different traditions. So the framework is not a way of saying, it's an alternative, and we're not saying we ought to export the framework everywhere, but we're saying that if we had an understanding like the framework in mainly Western countries, we would be able to say to cultures with different understandings, that's fine, you have your own stories, you have your own meanings. They're neither better nor worse than ours, but we can learn from yours, you can learn from ours. Yours make more sense in your culture, and ours make more sense in our culture. So it's a position of respect. It's not a position of we're going to take over the world with our diagnostic model. And the framework also goes beyond the usual things that we understand to contribute to distress. So at least in the UK, as I've said, there's quite a lot of recognition that difficult things that happen between people, hurt and neglect and abuse, can increase distress. But we want to go well beyond that, because the roots of distress lie in things also like colonization, like trauma that's passed down the generations, like our whole way of relating to the world, and this is true in the UK, which is a particular way of understanding people, which we haven't always had as a human species. We tend to see ourselves as very individual in the UK, not part of a social group. That's not always helpful. We tend to be cut off from our relationship with the natural world. That's not always helpful. We tend to be not at all interested in spiritual explanations. And we need to include all those as important ways of understanding where distress comes from and how it can heal. So one of the things I did recently was to go to New Zealand and share with a group of Maori people their understandings of distress, which is in terms of creation stories and the framework understandings of distress. And we discovered that although they're not identical, there were common themes. They are similar but not identical ways of making stories. It's not that one is better than the other, it's that one make particularly good sense in a particular culture. Okay, next slide. So really the framework is very centrally about creating stories, and I'm going to show you an example of a story in a minute. I'm going to be running slightly over, I'm afraid. So this is an example of a woman called Amanda who runs a peer group in the UK, and her peer group came across the framework and they decided to take the basic core questions and spend a bit of time every week as a group thinking about how that question applied to them. I'm going to show you at the end a link to a way of helping you to do that, to think about that as an individual or as a group. So Amanda has kindly allowed me to use her example. I won't read it out because I'm assuming this is going to be translated so you can read it for yourself. But in thinking about the impact of power in her life, this is what Amanda came up with. She's someone who's been in psychiatric services and told she had a diagnosis of personality disorder. And as you can see, she's had a lot of other very difficult experience as well. So that was her example, her answer to the first question. What has happened to you? And if we go to the next slide, this is her answer to what kind of threats did this pose to you? And as you can see, because she's been through so many difficult experiences, she has reacted in a whole lot of ways that, because she's been under threat in lots of areas of her life. Okay, I can assume people can have the slides, so if you haven't got time to read it at the moment, you can come back to it. You're very welcome to have the slides. So let's go on to the next question. This is the answer to what sense did you make of it? What was the meaning of these experiences? And very sadly, but this is quite common, Amanda decided that it was her fault, that people couldn't be trusted, that she didn't have any future. Those are the messages that the psychiatric system often gives people, of course. And if we go to the next question, these are the threat responses she uses. So because she'd been through so many difficult experiences, she's learned to do all sorts of things to survive, which she was told were symptoms of a mental illness. But from this point of view, these are understandable ways of trying to survive. She had to do this so that she could survive. Okay. And if we go to the next question, what are your strengths? Here you can see that actually she has many strengths despite all the difficult things she's been through. She's a strong, intelligent woman. She's developed relationships with other people. She's set up a peer group. She has a lovely family who care for her. And finally, she's put all this together in her story. So next slide. Yes, this is her way of putting it together. So it's the answers to the previous questions that she's put together. And I think you then can see, although it's a very difficult story, it is a story with an optimistic ending. She's got an idea about ways forward. She has strength, she has relationships. And I think you can see that it's a very different story from the story that the psychiatric system told her, which was, you have a personality disorder and you'll have it for life. So although this is not an easy story, it's an honest story and it's an optimistic story, and it shows that she has many strengths and she does not have to accept the label of personality disorder. She does not have to believe that she's mentally ill. So Amanda is one of the people who's helping us to offer training in the framework, which is very good because, of course, she has her own particular experience as a former mental health patient to bring to it. And other people in her group also found this a very helpful way of putting together their stories. Okay, so next slide. We're nearly finished. So the core of the framework is truth-telling, how helpful it can be to tell the truth, how recovery can be a process of reclaiming our experience in order to take back authorship of our own stories. We can write our own stories. We do not have to accept the stories that professionals, that the media, that our society tells us about ourselves. This is the final two slides. So this is some links to the top link is to a series of articles about how people are using the framework in different settings, both inside and outside services. The middle link is a document that will help you to think about how to put your story together. It's in English, I'm afraid, but if you can understand English, you could have a look at that. Soon there will be a simpler version of the framework. The link is at the bottom. It's going to be small and quite cheap in English again, but it will be a fairly simple way of understanding the framework and how it can be useful. And the final slide, this is some of the things that have happened since the framework was launched about 2.5 years ago. Lots of countries have shown an interest. There are several translations. It's being used in some services, described in textbooks. Not everybody likes it. We have also been subject to some personal attacks and abuse because some people don't think we should say these things. But I think that shows that the message is getting across, and it's a real pleasure to introduce the framework to a new audience. Thank you.
루시 박사님이 아직 줌에 접속을 안 했다고 해서요. 뭐 잠깐 그러면 접속하실 동안에 제가 좀 패널들 좀 오시고 그 루시 박사님 말씀을 간단하게 좀 요약을 해서 전해드리면 좋을 것 같아요. 우리가 흔히 정신건강에 문제가 있는 분들이 겪는 우울, 자살하고 싶은 충동, 그리고 극도로 이렇게 흥분되어 있는 것, 그리고 목소리를 듣는 것, 그리고 남들이 보지 못하는 이야기를 듣는 것, 이런 것들은 되게 이제까지 치료해야 될 어떤 대상이다라고 생각을 하고 있습니다. 그러나 이런 것들은 많은 경우에 루시 박사님의 말씀은 인간관계에서 생긴 어려움, 트라우마, 와 밀접한 관련이 있다는 것입니다. 근데 그러니까 이런 증상을 치료해야 된다라고 하는 생각을 갖게 될 때 우리는 이 사람이 겪게 된, 실제로 겪는 트라우마와 어려움들을 이제 귀를 기울이지 않는다는 것입니다. 그렇기 때문에 이걸 극복하는 방법은 각자가 겪은 이제 사회생활 속에서의 트라우마, 어려움 등을 다시 이제 재구성하는 게 필요하다는 것입니다. 이게 우울증으로 진단을 할 것이 아니라 내가 겪었던 여러 가지 어려움이라고 하는 것들을 재구성해야 그게 자기의 이야기가 될 때 이제 개인과 사회적 관계 속에서 생긴 문제들을 해결할 수 있는 방법 그리고 힘을 찾을 수 있다는 것입니다. 그래서 그러니까 자기의 이야기를 구성하는 것. 그러니까 나는 조현병이야 라고 하는 거는 전혀 의미가 없다는 것이죠. 나는 우울증이야. 나는 예컨대 그러니까 정동장애가 있어. 이런 것들은 전혀 의미가 없이 내 이야기, 내가 겪었던 트라우마와 어려움을 이 어떤 것이었다라고 하는 것들을 구성해내는 것, 자기를 다시 이제 되짚어 보는 거죠. 그러니까 거기에서 그 문제를 극복할 수 있는 또 힘을 찾게 되는 것이고, 또 그것이 우리 사회를 더 낫게 하는, 그러니까 나를 낫게 하는 것뿐만 아니라 우리 사회를 개선할 수 있는 그런 힘을 찾게 되는 것이다라는 말씀이었던 것 같습니다. 지금 루시 박사님이 접속을 했다고 합니다. Hi, Lucy. Do you
Hello,
hear me?
I can see you and hear you.
Do you
Thank
hear
you.
me?
I can, yes, nice to be here.
Just a moment. We cannot hear you.
Oh, I can hear you.
Okay. Thank you very much for participating in this conference and so wonderful presentation. So we invite 3 panelists. I introduce you them. Dae-hwan Kim and Jong-won Park, Hangyu Lee. Park and Lee are Korean peer movement leaders. And Dae-hwan Kim is a mental health worker as a social worker who has long been involved in improvement of Korean mental health services. And they will ask you some questions on your presentation. And we invited another person, PhD candidate Yoo Jung-kim. She helps translation to you.
Okay.
Okay, let's start.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Good.
박종원,
네,
Mr. Park.
네, 안녕하세요, 루시 선생님. 저는 정신장애인들이 만드는 대한언론 마인드포스트의 박정훈 기자라고 합니다. 선생님, 혹시 영국이나 유럽에 정신장애인 당사자들이 만들고 있는 어떤 언론이 있는지 궁금하고요. 또 하나는 주류 언론에서 정신장애와 정신질환과 관련돼서 편견에 사로잡힌 그 기사를 냈을 경우에 어떻게 대응을 하시는지 2가지가 궁금합니다.
Hello, I'm a reporter from Mindpost, which is a media for people with mental disorders. I was curious, in the UK or in Europe, are there any media or newspapers for people with mental disorders specifically? And my second question is, how do people respond to news articles that may imply prejudice against or stigma on people with mental disorders?
Sorry, can you repeat the second question? How do people respond to
news articles or
Yes.
newspapers that imply prejudice or stigma on people with mental disorders?
Okay. Okay, thank you. So the first question, I mean, in the UK, the peer support movement and the survivor movement is quite active and busy. And there are a number of small magazines and blogs and articles that are put out by people who have been diagnosed with mental disorders. Do you want to translate that and then I'll continue? Or
Yeah, we'll translate it first.
지금 첫 번째 질문에 관해서는 그러니까 영국에서 지금 피어 스포트, 그러니까 당사자 운동을 하시는 분들이 발행하는 그러니까 그런 잡지들 이런 것들이 굉장히 많다고 이야기합니다. 비록 소규모 그룹으로 하고 있긴 하지만 이런 것들이 굉장히 많다고 합니다. Please go on.
And there are a great many articles in the national press at the moment about mental health. It was headline news yesterday on the main news channel, on the television. It's a big, big topic in the UK at the moment. And a lot of the messages are about we mustn't stigmatise people with mental health problems. So there's a big movement which is called an anti-stigma movement. From the point of view of the power threat meaning framework, we don't always agree with what these movements say because they are very much putting forward the usual message that these are illnesses and people can't help it. And unfortunately, these illnesses happen out of the blue for no apparent reason, and they're because of chemical imbalances in the brain and so on. Whereas the message of the framework is these are not illnesses, these are understandable responses to people's life circumstances. So there is a big effort to counter stigma, but actually we know from research that telling people they have medical illnesses actually increases stigma because it makes these experiences seem frightening and hard to understand.
예, 지금 영국에서는 그러니까 뭐 전국 단위 언론들, TV 이런 데에서 이제 정신질환에 대해서 그러니까 스티그마를 주지 않아야 된다. 반 스티그마 운동 이런 것들을 굉장히 많이 하고 있다고 합니다. 그래서 정신질환의 경우에는 누구나 다 걸릴 수 있는 것이고 이거는 뇌의 화학적 불균형 때문에 그런 것이다. 라는 이야기, 그러니까 이런 이야기를 하면서 이 부분들에 대해서 스티그마를 줘서는 안 된다. 그러니까 이전까지는 주로 이게 사람의 성격의 문제라든지 이런 식으로 많이 생각했는데 이게 그냥 다른 질환과 마찬가지의 질환의 문제다. 그렇기 때문에 그러니까 동일한 질환의 문제이기 때문에 그러니까 여기에 대해서 스티그마를 줘서는 안 된다라고 이야기를 그런 그러니까 굉장히 넓은 운동들이 있다라고 이야기합니다. 그런데 지금 루시 박사님의 말씀은 그런 메시지가 정신질환에 대해서 스티그마를 주고 있다. 그러니까 굉장히 역설적인 일들이 일어나고 있다라는 말씀을 하고 있습니다. Let's go on. And then so we will continue the second panelist asking you question. 리, 한규리, 이한 교수님.
제가 먼저.
먼저 하십니다.
네, 안녕하세요. 저는 한국정신장애인협회 이한규라고 합니다. 저는 두 가지가 궁금한데요. 첫 번째, 이게 보통 정신질환이 정신과적 진단으로 해서 결정되는데, PTM 프레임워크가 지금 교수님 연구를 해서 이거 활동을 하고 있는데, 제가 이 프레젠테이션을 보니까 아직 영국 전체에서 시행되고 있는 게 아니고 앞으로 런던에서 이번 병동에서 시행될 예정이라고 하는데 어떠한 장애물이 있는지, 예를 들면 국가나 뭐 의료계에서 반대가 있어서 전국에 못한다든지 아직까지 시행을 못하고 있는지가 첫 번째 궁금하고요. 두 번째는 이 PTM 프레임워크를 연구하면서 정신장애 당사자와 함께 시작을 할 때와 끝났을 때 어떤 변화가 있었는지 그런 사례들을 데이터를 가지고 있는지 묻고 싶습니다.
So in your presentation, I saw that the PTM framework was created as an alternative to psychiatric diagnosis and is planned to be used in an inpatient ward in London. I wanted to know about if there are any obstacles to make that happen. Like, do medical professionals agree with the framework or not? And I would like to know about the actual application of the PTM framework to people with mental disorders in practice setting, and if they are actually satisfied with it.
Okay, that's a good question. The idea of the framework, you're right, is that it should be instead of psychiatric diagnosis, and it's being used quite a lot outside services as well as inside services. So outside services, perhaps in charities or other smaller organizations, it is much more possible to use it without being based on a diagnostic model. Do you want to translate that bit first and then?
이게 지금 그러니까 정신건강 시스템 안에서 이게 이 PTM 프레임워크를 쓰는 경우도 있고, 그다음에 이제 정신건강 시스템 내부에서 쓰는 경우가 있다고 합니다. 그런데 정신건강 시스템 외부에서 쓰는 것은 이제 우리처럼 비영리기관, 그러니까 자선단체들에서 소규모로 이제 진단을 받지 않고 이 PTM 프레임워크를 활용해서 서비스를 제공하는 것도 있다라고 이야기를 하고 있습니다. Please go on.
Okay, but you're right that the work that's happening on some inpatient wards and in services is rather different because, of course, the diagnostic model is very much part of the system. So within services, then the framework is much more running alongside a diagnostic model. And it's not helpful to get into a kind of fight about that because otherwise you don't get professionals on board with it. So to some extent, to quite a large extent, you have to go along with, you know, what the system already is. If you translate that first, then I'll add something to that.
지금 이제 정신건강 시스템 안의 경우, 특히 이제 입원 환자들에 대해서 서비스 제공하는 부분들은 이제 이 PTM 프레임워크가 대체하는 것이 아니라 정신과 진단과 함께 그것과 이제 일부 부분적으로 이렇게 쓰이고 있는 중이다라고 말씀하십니다. Please go on.
So what has the reaction been? Well, the reaction to the framework has been quite mixed. Many people are very positive about it, but some people are very, very strongly opposed to it. And psychiatrists in the UK have mixed views about it, to be honest. I think a lot of psychiatrists would agree with some of it, but they wouldn't agree with getting rid of diagnosis. But some psychiatrists have been very supportive and are very keen to take the framework on as a whole, but they're not necessarily the people in power who are able to do that. So not surprisingly, it's proved controversial. And our aim is just to let people use it in whatever way seems possible. And, you know, we see it as part of a much bigger change that will take many years to happen.
예, 지금 그러니까 이 PTM 프레임워크에 대한 반응 가운데서 특히 정신과 의사 선생님들의 경우에는 상당히 복합적이다. 그러니까 많은 사람들은 이 부분에서 긍정적이지만 일부는 매우 강하게 반대하고 있다라고 이렇게 이야기를 하시고요. 일부 또 이 부분에 관해서 긍정적인 분들의 경우에도 그러니까 큰 방향에서 이제 그러니까 올바른 지적이다라고 하는 부분도 있고 또 부분적으로 이것을 또 활용하는 경우도 있다. 이렇게 이야기합니다. 그래서 이 PTM 프레임워크가 많이 활용이 되기까지에는 즉 진단 대신에 이렇게 이제 스토리로 이야기를 다시 재구성하는 거죠. 그러니까 이것이 확산되기까지는 아직까지 많은 시간이 필요한 것 같다라고 말씀하십니다. Please go on.
Yeah, that's it. It's a work in progress. It's a work in progress.
Okay, thank you. And then the next panelist, 대환 김.
네, 안녕하세요. 정신건강사회복지사 김대환입니다. 그 이야기 조금 들어보니까 일본 베델의 집의 당사자연구와 또 핀란드의 오픈 다이얼로그와 상당히 유사한 것 같고요. 우리들이 많은 사람들과 대화를 잘하는 것 같지만 사실 각자 경험과 의미의 해석이 달라서 그렇지 않다는 것을 알 수 있습니다. 그래서 그 모놀로그가 아니라 다이얼로그에 관한 내용인 것 같습니다. 첫 번째 질문은 당사자분들이 자기 표현을 잘 못하셔서 자기의 말과 이야기를 잘하지 못하는 당사자에게 이 프레임워크에서는 어떻게 힘을 줘야 하는지 그게 궁금하고요. 아까 질문 미리 못 드렸는데 이제 제가 들으면서 또 생각난 건 당사자들의 고통을 지원자의 고정관념이 아니라 그 당사자나 아니면 새로운 의미로 해석할 수 있는 연습 방법이 있는지 보통 우리가 고정관념으로 당사자의 고통, 어려움을 해석해버리잖아요. 네. 기존의 관념대로 따라오려고 기존의 관념에 맞추려고 하는데 혹시 그런 연습 방법이 있는지 이 두 가지를 질문하고 싶습니다.
In your presentation, you emphasized the importance of telling full life stories. It's not like monologue, it has to be a dialogue. What are your recommendations to empower those who cannot express themselves quite well? And also, second question is, when you're trying to interpret the peers' pain and stress, Do you have any other new perspective to approach that?
I'm not sure if I understand the second question, sorry.
So when you're trying to understand the peers' pain or stress as a worker, how what do you recommend as a new approach?
So may I add some explanation? So in Korea, many I would like to explain in advance our Korean systems. There are many people with mental health problems who are not accustomed to expressing their own feeling.
Okay.
Yeah. So yes. And then, so his question is whether or how social workers or peers can help them to express their own feeling or stress.
Okay. Thank you. So I guess the first thing to say is that the framework is not a kind of manual of how to do it. It's a set of ideas, and we very much wanted to leave it up to people in their own settings to work out how will this work best in my particular setting. But I can tell you some things that seem to have worked in the UK, but of course things may be rather different in South Korea. Do you want to translate that bit first?
지금 PTM 프레임워크이라고 하는 것은 매뉴얼이 아니라, 그러니까 이게 한 일종의 아이디어를 정리해 놓은 것이기 때문에, 그러니까 영국 상황에서 이게 적용되는 것, 그리고 한국 상황에서 적용되는 것이 다를 수가 있다. 그리고 그러니까 그 부분들을 유념해서 이 프레임워크를 이해를 해야 된다라는 말씀이신 것 같아요. Please go on.
So, I guess the first thing to say is that telling your story is a very long process, usually for lots of people. It's not something you just do and then you've done it. It's something that may take months, years. In a way, our stories are always changing and evolving. And the framework encourages any way that you want to express your story or tell your story. So if you're not good at putting things into words, that might be through poetry or art or all sorts of ways in which people might be helped to express themselves. Do you want to translate that bit first?
이게 이제 자기 이야기를 하는 것은 굉장히 긴 과정이어서 어떨 때는 한 달이 걸리기도 하고 1년이 걸리기도 하는 그런 긴 과정이라고 그럽니다. 여기에는 굉장히 다양한 방법들이 동원될 수가 있다라고 이야기를 하고 있습니다. Yeah.
And for some societies, this is less true. In many Western societies, then there are ways of expressing pain collectively, aren't there? In kind of, community meetings or songs or rituals or things that I think actually we have forgotten about to a large extent in the West. So it doesn't have to be all about your personal story and you personally putting it into words or expressing your feelings. Do you want to say that bit? And then I'll say a bit more.
Sorry, I missed some words.
Yes,
Yes.
I was saying it expressing yourself and healing pain doesn't have to be all about one-to-one work. And in many societies, although I think Western societies have often forgotten a lot of this, there are ways of doing that collectively.
Yeah, yes. 지금 그러니까 그 개인이 겪었던 여러 가지 이제 스트레스라든지 또는 뭐 감정 이런 것들을 표현하는 것이 그러니까 말로 이렇게 표현하는 것이 쉽지는 않은데 그거는 문화마다 조금 약간 다르겠죠. 영국 같은 경우는 개인적으로 1대1로 해서 이렇게 이야기하는 경우도 있지만 여러 사람들이 같이 모여서 가령 예를 들어서 같은 경험 있는 사람들이 같이 모여가지고 이야기를 할 때도 그러니까 그런 것들이 표현되는 경우들도 있다라고 이야기를 하십니다. Thank you. Yeah.
But I think it's also, the framework is not just about expressing feelings, it's very much about ideas. And one of its main aims is to give people different ideas, different kinds of knowledge about their pain. So one of the things that peers in the UK have found helpful is to have group meetings every week where they talk through the ideas together. They talk through the answers to the questions, perhaps taking one question every week. So that doesn't necessarily mean you have to say anything very personal about yourself, but it's giving you ideas, it's giving you ways to think, which may be different ways of thinking. And that is one way of freeing yourself from a trap that a diagnosis puts you in. And, you know, I would recommend that as a good starting point, actually, thinking about the ideas and thinking about them together. And as much as you want to, sharing whether that makes sense to you.
Thank you. 지금 프레임워크 이야기하는 것은 자신의 감정이라든지 스트레스를 단지 표현하는 것, 이것만 아니라고 이야기합니다. 중요한 것은 이제 그런 스트레스에 대한 아이디어, 그러니까 이것을 어떻게 해결할 것인가에 대한 아이디어, 그리고 거기에 대한 지식을 서로 이렇게 나누는 것, 이런 것들이 굉장히 중요하다고 그럽니다. 사람들이 모여서 자신이 겪었던 여러 가지 이제 고통들에 대해서 이것을 어떻게 이해할 것인가, 어떻게 극복할 것인가라고 하는 것에 관한 아이디어와 지식들을 교환하게 되면은 그것 자체가 정신질환이다, 혹은 스트레스라고 하는 거 우리가 덫에 이렇게 갇혀 있을 수가 있잖아요. 그런 덫으로부터 벗어날 수 있는 그런 기회를 제공하게 되는 것이다라고 말씀하십니다. And
okay, that's it. I mean, the video might be a useful way of sharing ideas, for example. Now you've got
yes, yeah. 다른 질문은 없으신가요? 예. Thank you very much. And I hope you meet in the near future in person.
I hope so. I hope so. It's been a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Bye. Bye.